We have an interesting speaker tonight, and Mr. Dr. Mark Lax will be speaking on tips and tricks for researching our Air Force's stories. Now, Mark is an Air Force Air Commodore, retired, educator and aviation historian. We know that. With over 45 years of permanent and reserve service, together with a master's and a PhD in military history, he has a unique insight into the RAF and its achievements through the decades. He's got a number of publications that he's put out, and we're very grateful for that.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks everybody for joining me tonight. I come forward with a little trepidation because a lot of the people in the audience are very skilled in researching and looking up Air Force history stuff. But that's not the main reason. I'm more worried about the fact that the cricket's about to start in about 15 minutes. So I'm going to keep you from it, but then it will go for 5 days, so you'll have plenty of time to catch up. Yes, so I put together a bit of an eclectic mix of bits and pieces for this. One's tempted to say, oh, it's easy, it's all on the internet. I've heard that many, many times, and I try to dispel their beliefs in that. But a lot of it is on the internet, and a lot more is coming every day. So without much more to do, I'm going to share my screen. I hope this will work. Let me know if it does not. Now you should see a full screen with tips and tricks of research with the background of books in the background. Can you see that?
Yes, that's good.
Great. So that's my my topic. Now, if I was in the audience, I'd say, oh, I'd like to know what sort of books this guy's got in the back there. So there's some of my books. I thought you'd give you a bit of a quick look, because one of the things I would recommend to anybody that's interested in doing this, either as an amateur or a professional or for family interest, is to start a collection of specialist books in a library. That's about 1/5 of my book collection, maybe a bit less. I moved house recently. I gave 1,000 away, mostly to the Air Force, and I think they've gone to good homes. But it's always worthwhile keeping the specialist ones. So that's that. Okay, history. History is about interpretation. It's about interpretation from you as the writer, how you decide to write it, research it, present it, format it, lay it out. And it's also the interpretation of you as the reader. Every reader will see something different, would look for something different, and be interested in something different. You'll get people that say, gee, that was a great book, and you'll get people that say that was a load of rubbish. And I've had both, but you just have to put up with that because that's their decision. That's what they thought. So the scope of tonight, I just thought I'd sort of jot a few things down. The types of military history, because there are many varied types. What are the sources of military history records? How you might organise some of your research. Particular focus on people, because people are most interesting and often most difficult to track down. Researching squadrons and bases and researching campaigns. Not so too much of that. Okay, have a think about this. Which of these would you say is military history? We've got Biggles on the left. You've got the Battle of Longtan by a fairly well-known author, Mr. Peter Fitzsimons. And you've got Going Solo by Dr. Alan Stevens, The History of the Air Force 46 to 71. Well, this is my opinion, that one's a ripping yarn, one's a believable story, and one's probably a reference book. And all three have a different target audience, and all three are enjoyed by that audience. So what would you say they were? Well, I would say that the first is fiction, made up. I'd say that Peter's work is faction, which is kind of a combination based on facts and embellished stories. Now, I'm not maligning the gentleman now. He's actually been quite open and said this. He says he makes up a lot of the tales, and it's a bestseller. Biggles probably sold the most. Peter Fitzsimons is pretty close. He sells 250,000 books of just about everything he writes. And then Going Solo is factual based on sources and records. Well, I'm of the sort of genre on the right there. So I don't tend to deal with making up stuff. I'm no good at writing fiction. Others are expert at that. So that's kind of where I'm focusing. And you could argue that to a lesser or greater extent, they're all some sort of military history. I don't know how many young men and young women have read Biggles, but it got them into the Air Force, or at least into the Air Force cadets, and certainly it started their careers. And of course, then there's aircraft books, and there's thousands of them. Brett, I'll be pleased to see I found a copy of the Classic Hornet by JQ. It's a picture I nicked off the internet. It's obviously some advertising. It's out there now. But these are many and varied, and there are literally thousands of them. So I'm not really going to talk about researching specific aircraft, because that's a different topic altogether, and something which a lot of you and the members out there are very familiar with. So today I really want to concentrate on researching using the historical record and turning it into something that people want to read. A lot of the official histories that have been produced over the years, they do what they say they do, but they're not exactly exciting reading, and they are reference books of a sort. So you've got to try to thread that line between something that people are interested in, something that's telling them the full story. I don't use the term the truth, because that's very debatable, but it also has to be presentable for something that some people would like to read. And so there's a couple of examples there on the screen. I'm not trying to sell any of my books. I don't make any money from any of them, so that's no point. But I just want to use it. This is an example of the sort of range of historical military or aircraft books that you can put your mind to, and they don't suit everybody. And of course, you've got base histories like the history of East Sale. You've got a campaign history like the Malayan Emergency. You've got the Gestapo Hunters and Alamein to the Alps, and a few others which are specific squadron histories. F-111 is an aircraft history, and the one down the bottom you probably never heard of. It's a biography that I wrote for the family about Alec Barlow, who was the CEO of 6th Squadron that took the Hudsons to Milne Bay during the war, and had a very remarkable life because he became the general manager of Qantas in the late 60s and early 70s. Another story. So with that, what you write and how you present is very important, and it starts with your sources. And you can dig deep and go too far. And sometimes I tell people, particularly students that I've spoken to, it's very easy to go down a dark alley and get murdered in the corner. In other words, you find something that looks really, really interesting. It's not quite the subject you started with, but you get so sucked in that it consumes you in terms of time and effort. So sources are very important, and pick carefully. Okay. What about sources? What about writing? Well, you have to be able to answer the big question. Where did you get that from? Because there are a lot of experts out there, some of them more expert than others, and they will be quite happy to criticize your work because they think that you got something wrong, or that you didn't look it up properly, or that you didn't cross-check it. So that's the way of an author. You just have to live with that. And I've had it too. I wrote the book, The History of the Air Force from 72 to 96. And I don't know, 600 pages or something, Fredo. And I had one person say it's all rubbish because he was on a certain mission and the dates I had were 2 days out. Well, I just said, why don't you write an article in the magazine about it? I'm still waiting to read the article. So you get that. Anyway, where did you get that from is really, really important. All right. What types of sources are there? Probably really two. I've added tertiary. I'll talk about what they are in a sec. But they're many and varied, and they come in very different forms. Primary, and I promise I won't kill you with PowerPoint slides with lots of text. This is mainly for me to keep an eye on what I'm talking about. But its original material was made at the time, or very, very soon after, or thereabouts, from people that either were there or were officially in charge of recording, or had some involvement in what happened. Reliable oral histories. I'd use that in trepidation because the older we get, the better we were. And unfortunately, a lot of the oral histories, which we do get many years after the event, memories fade and things might not be quite as what actually happened according to the official records, but some very, very good oral histories. And the best ones I've found are the ones when I interviewed the guys from Bomber Command 462 Squadron. They knew exactly when they got shot at by a Messerschmitt when they were bombing Berlin. They can tell you the time of the night, how many bombs they dropped, what the mission was, who the captain was, and how many aircraft were lost that day. Well, that was a life-defining moment for them. So I trust that implicitly. But others, you say, oh, I was a ground crew and I was, working on this airplane and that airplane, and I was there between these dates. Well, you look up their record and no, they weren't. They were somewhere else. So oral histories are interesting and used with a little trepidation. Diaries, once again, are pretty good, especially by those people that were there on site. I'll talk a little bit more about diaries in a sec. Letters home. Letters home often were censored, but in between the censor's writing and the author's writing, you get a feel for the circumstances. You get a feel for the person, the social environment that they were in, and so forth. And that's a really important part of a collective history. It's not just about we took off, we dropped bombs, we turned, and one of our guys didn't make it. It's about what they felt, how they lived, how their loved ones felt, and the letters home are really, really important. And other recorded material from time to time. Basically, we're talking eyewitness reports, whether they're on paper, photography, or tapes, audio tape. Photographs. Photographs can be particularly useful, and I'll show you an example of one in a minute, particularly if they've got captions on the back or come with some sort of photo album which has got records in it by the photographer. They do a couple of things. One, generally speaking, they show you the person that this is obviously the photographer or his mates, and you've now got a picture of people in the squadron or the unit or whatever. And often as not, it places certain people in certain places in certain times. And again, I'll show you how that works in a minute. Original peer-reviewed research listing sources. And that's the sort of thing that Alan Stevens' book, Going Solo, I would add his as a primary source in the sense that he footnotes everything, and all his sources are from official records. So you've got that opportunity to go back, go to the archives or wherever the source was, and then re-reference it and check for yourself. Government documents, you'd be surprised how much is in Hansard, parliamentary debates, not just in Australia, but also in the UK, if it's something to do with World War II in Europe, for example. And also there's American records, Library of Congress and so forth. Things like census data, defence reports, white papers. Defence reports, pretty boring, but they give you statistics. You can work out budgets, and does that affect whatever the story is that you're presenting? So things like that you can quickly look up. Most of them electronic, available on the internet, and you can do a quick search and get the data. And dare I say it, newspaper reporting. Often newspapers embellish the story, fancy that. But nevertheless, they do give the gist of what happened, especially if it's an event such as the award of a DFC to someone in front of the Queen or the King. That's probably pretty right because it would have been checked. So you've got the newspaper reports, and the best resource we have in Australia is Trove. I cannot speak so highly of it. National Library of Australia have done a fantastic job in digitising so many of those papers and magazines. Makes it so helpful. So yeah, they're the primary sources. There may be others I haven't thought of, but they would be primary. And there's some examples. The diary at the top corner was the Joe Bull diary. That was a day-by-day entry from an airman who was on the ground, not a pilot, not an observer, who recorded everything that happened at the squadron. Probably told not to do it. Probably been illegal to keep a diary and take pictures. He took 500 photos as well. So thank you very much, Joe Bull, the late Joe Bull. Professional journals that appeared review. Other notes that might have been made at the time. Here's something to do with the raid on one of the German Gestapo headquarters, written by somebody. Official records. This one here in the bottom right is Australian Flying Corps in France between these states. It's in the National Archives in the UK, but you can go over and access those if you've got the time, or you can pay for having them digitised and they will send them to you, but it costs you a fair bit. Photographs with captions. There you go. It's got all the names of all the pilots, so you can work out when it was taken. It's obviously a Meteor 77 squadron, and the CO and all his flight commanders and so forth. Personal reminiscences. This is not a particular lady I know, but I mean, it's just an example that she's obviously been at Interfet. She's obviously very proud of her service, and because it's fairly recent times, her oral history is probably pretty good, certainly from a personal perspective. Audio tapes, well, the oral history program that the Air Force run is getting bigger and bigger, and Fredo could probably talk a bit more about that than I could. Excuse me a minute. But nevertheless, it's becoming quite a valuable resource to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I put the cutaway of the Halifax down there as a part of from a technical publication. But if you're talking about your Uncle Bill, who parachuted out of a burning Halifax, it might be very handy to know how the hell he got out, where the doors were, where the escape hatches were, and what the general outlay of the aircraft was. So if you're going to be talking about Uncle Bill's career, his flying career, that sort of thing could be really, really useful. Okay, secondary sources, material one step away from the primary, written or recorded later by someone who was probably there, but has decided 10 years later to put down their life story or something like that. Non-eyewitness sources. Hearsay is a bit of a worry, but sometimes you might have a collective wisdom generated in the mess room where something is put down and been kept. It's a secondary source. You need to check that with a primary source to make sure it's correct. Most previously written material about the topic, books, magazine articles, a lot of the internet stuff. It's after the fact. It's used somebody else's work usually, or someone else's research, or they've done their own research, but it's their impressions. Remember I said it's about the impressions of the writer as well as the reader. And so I call that secondary material. Analysis by others, explanation or interpretation. A lot of modern historians like to analyze, the bombing of Germany, or the attack on Pearl Harbor, or the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a lot of material like that. That if it's good analysis and it uses sources and it's their impressions of what happened, it can be quite useful. It can give you an idea, a pathway you might like to look at, or you might want to dismiss it. But the fact it's been done is a reason that you should also check it, because you don't want to be just regurgitating the same stuff, although a lot of people do, including me. Scholarly articles on topic by subject matter experts. Yep, and I probably don't need to say too much more about that. And some documentaries and biographies are quite useful as secondary sources, particularly when they have interviews with the direct family, if the member themselves is not there, has passed on. But they can be useful to give you an idea. And documentaries in particular are useful for giving you an idea of how you want to present your information. How do they start? How do they develop the story? How does it go into side issues? How does it come back and then become a conclusion? And so that's important too. And there's a few examples here. I just picked a few. I don't know these chaps at the bottom left, but I thought they would be the sort of characters you might like to talk to. Clearly, they've got some World War II service amongst them, and depending on what you're researching, they might be extremely helpful. But a lot of the other stuff has been written after the time. The 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. Patrick Bishop did write stuff a lot earlier than that. It's just a rehash of his work. But there's a lot of other stuff. And of course, Air Force News is particularly useful. They do pretty well, and they do check their facts, so you can be sure that it's reasonably accurate. Recollections. I'm always dubious about recollections. I've also added the Dream of Wings that I wrote in there as well. The reason is, generally speaking, the author tends to fall in love with their subject. And I'm not picking on any of these people, but the ones to be really wary of the type of the top corner, My Father's War. Clearly, a direct family relation. Her father was obviously perfect. He didn't make any mistakes. He was a great leader. He should have won the VC, but didn't. Now, I don't know. I'm not just maligning this lady, but there's so many of these stories that over-embellish their loved ones' careers and histories, particularly if the loved one's now passed and it's part of the family. It's part of the family history. Yeah, there's enough said about that. So just be wary. They're worth reading. A lot of them are very, very good. Don't get me wrong. But you just have to go with an open mind about sort of what angle the author's looking at. If it's an autobiography, well, it'd be very rare that they actually say they screwed up a lot. with human nature being what it is, but that's the way it goes. The one that I'd probably say would be unlike the others is Alan Moyer's Spitfire Pilot about his father. It's an excellent biography, and it pulls no punches. It's very good, and that's just my opinion. Okay, tertiary sources, personal and public opinion, critiques written by someone that was never there or didn't know about it. Get a lot of those. Unauthorized records and unreferenced manuscripts. People make stuff up. They think they can make a quick buck out of it. Dare I say, there must be 10,000 books on Bomber Command now. A lot of them were not actually anything to, the people that wrote them had no knowledge of Bomber Command. They just got on the bandwagon. That's an example. My prediction will be in about 10 years' time, we'll be seeing the same with Vietnam. It's started, but we'll just see. And hearsay, anecdotes, mess talk, lines books, all that sort of stuff. Please avoid. Have a look and then toss them out. Okay, let's get down to research. Now, as soon as you begin, this is a bit of do as I say, not as I do. So I have to say I'm complicit in terms of not doing a lot of this, but it's still something that I would suggest people think about. Collect, read, annotate, and add to a bibliography. And the bibliography, I actually do start when I start reading stuff, and I'll use that, even if it's only a paragraph in a page of 300, it becomes part of your bibliography. And a bibliography does two things. One, it gives you credibility in terms that you've actually gone off, presumably you've gone and looked at this. And two, it gives you a reference to come back to later if you wanted to do something similar, or you might want to know where you got something from in the first instance. It's just my opinion. Computer folders and color code them. Now, I'm not going to advertise any of the products, but if you go on the internet, there's a number of little apps that are free you can download that will allow you to put a color on the folder. And I think it would look something like that. That's just an example I picked. You can pick and choose whatever colors you want. You don't have to color them at all, but it makes it very simple when you're looking for Luftwaffe information. You go, straight to the purple. So that's an idea that you might like to pick up on. It's very simple. They don't cost anything. And do the same with paper folders. I'm forever copying stuff, printing stuff off, file it and shovel it in a particular order. So you know that it's about people, it's about the squadron, it's about the COs, it's about the bases, it's about the claims they had, whatever, the bombing targets they went to, or, depending on what genre you're looking at. Collect photos and illustrations. If I go to someone's place that I organise to interview, excuse me a minute, I ask if they have photos, and I ask if I can scan them and return them to them. Especially useful if they got captions, because they date, place, and they name the people. They're very useful for backfilling, like, was Bill there at the same time as Johnny? Well, there's a picture of the two of them in the picture. Well, yeah, they were. So that's very handy. And don't forget to credit the source, even though depends on what period you're writing about. But I think if it's before 1953, photos are copyright free, which is why you go to the War Memorial website and there's a picture of, say, Bull Goering in his outfit in Sunderland behind him. It says copyright free. And so you still should credit the War Memorial if you get it from them, or buy it, or they download it or whatever, should still credit them as a source. Most of the photos in fact, just about all the ones I use are RAF official, and I always acknowledge them. So even though I might have got them from Billy Bob's collection, if it looks like it's a PR photo that everybody in the squadron got a copy of, it's still RAF official. But it's nice to say that Bill Smith was the person who gave it to me. And think about copyright, and that is something which I don't need to discuss now, but you are all aware of it. Okay, photos. There's just some examples I plucked. Looks like a Hudson, I think it is, in the corner. There's an F-111, that's good. There's a chap in a cockpit. There's a few crews. Who the hell are they? Well, you don't know until you got the captions, and they tell you that it's the first flight of our F-111s. It's 459 Squadron at Gambit in 1943. It's one squadron's reinforcements. It doesn't name them all, but there's a couple of names there, and so forth. And so that really builds up part of your story, especially if you're going to illustrate it. So that's why photos are useful. Okay, research. Where do we start? What are we looking for? I would start with official documents, and they're spread everywhere. The Australian War Memorial, the National Archives, the National Library of Australia has quite a lot of stuff, particularly manuscripts and diaries, and also maps and photographs. So don't forget the National Library. Air Force Museum down at Point Cook has got an excellent research facility, but you'll need to go and arrange to go and visit that, because I don't think they do work for the public unless they visit. I'm not sure. You have to check them. Office of Air Force History here in Canberra has some records, and they're very, very helpful. You need to ask them, request what you want, and they will get back to you. And of course, there's the published official histories, which have been very carefully checked, and they're pretty accurate. Now, international sources depends on what sort of history or person or whoever, whatever you're researching is, but there's a lot out there. The National Archives of UK is particularly good, and you have to pay for some of the stuff, but you can get some of it for free. The RAF Air Historical Branch holds stuff, but generally speaking, they don't deal with the public. You normally have to go through the National Archives, and the Air Force Historical Branch will release it. Imperial War Museum, particularly useful for manuscripts and photos. Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Everybody that's been killed in war, First World War, Second World War, and I think they're putting up some other ones now, has a Commonwealth War Grave if they know where they are, or is at least known unto God. But their records are kept by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and you can go onto the internet website, put the name or the service number in, and you can get a bit more detail about them. And the London Gazette. Do not forget the London and Commonwealth Gazettes, because every time someone's awarded something, it's generally put in the Gazette, and it's gazetted for everybody to read. More of that in a minute. Publications and magazine articles. Wings Magazine, I'd have to put in a plug for the Air Force Association there. It's pretty good. But there are others, AHSA's magazines, of course, which I'm a member as well. Trove, now RAF News, Air Force News, and Air Force. It's all the same magazine. They just keep changing the blasted name of it. I'm not sure why, but I think it's for public relations purposes. But Air Force News started in 1960. Actually, there was a little bit of it during the Second World War, but it got canned because it was giving too much information to the Japanese. But then it started again in 1960, and it's run through to the present day every 2 weeks, I think it is. Hansard. All the government discussions about stuff that happened with defence, with the Air Force, with the purchases, with accidents, all that stuff's in Hansard, and it's searchable. You need to go onto the Parliamentary House website, click on the Hansard button, but you'll need to look on either the Senate or the House of Reps Hansard, not the general Hansard button. And somewhere in there, it will say records before 1990 or something. And it's got all of the Hansards right back to Federation. Defence reports, ministerial press releases. Now, again, ministers like to make a big deal about these things, but generally speaking, they usually say how much it cost, what it was, how well the government did to buy it, and where it's going to be put. So that's pretty handy for those people researching stuff. Personal interviews and recordings I've talked about, and dare I say it, the internet. Travel with care. Okay, I thought the main point of this might be researching people, because a lot of people out there, not just our interest group, but a lot of people are interested in particularly their family or an extended family member, and it can be a bit frightening to someone who's maybe got a bit of information but not the lot. So where to find about people, particularly Air Force people. War Memorials, good start. Honour rolls, honours and awards, personnel lists. The National Archives of Australia. If you do go to the research button, don't put in Billy Bob, William James Smith, because you'll get 10,000 hits. But if you put in his service number, it'll probably come up pretty quickly. 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 hits will be the service number. So if you're looking for a person in the archives, put in the service number, and generally speaking, if it's been digitised, it'll come straight up. If it hasn't been digitised, it may be open or closed. You can request it. If it's closed, it has to be cleared. And what I would suggest is that some files actually have closed sections within the open file. blue envelope, double sealed with cipher seals that it's not to be opened until a certain date or only by a certain person. That's probably things like courts martial records or other rather unsavory things that might be in the file. So they're not open to the public. But generally speaking, the majority of those files are fully open. The average airman from World War II is about 42 pages of file, roughly speaking, and they're very helpful. Every Air Force officer was in an Air Force list. We call it the stud book. And it goes from 1921, and they stopped them in 2007. So if you're looking up something that happened in, let's say, Afghanistan, and you want to find out who the CEO of the squadron was, or the Iraq squadron, and his name's Mel Hupfield, you'll be able to find out a bit more about him when he was promoted, what his seniority was, and so forth. It's in the Air Force list, but you just have to find the right year. DVA produced nominal rolls of World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and I'm sure they're working on the ones in more recent conflicts. They're of Graves Commission, Air Force News, Trove, the Australian Dictionary Biography. Many people don't know about this. It's run out of the ANU. They've been producing short biographies for, I guess you call them significant, maybe not well known, just significant Australians. And there's a armed forces panel that looks at military people that should have been recognised otherwise that they might not have been. I've done about 6 or 7 entries for it. David Shannon, Dam Buster, was one of the ones I wrote. They are extremely good because they're very carefully reviewed by a panel of experts, and they're open. They're on the internet too. So if you want to look up the name of somebody, you can go and find out. And the gazettes. All right. Let's have a quick look. Some of you may recognise these chaps. Well, you'll probably recognise the one on the left as Bluey Truscott. But I'm just going to make up this little example. It's a bit fake, but it just shows you how you might track it down. We know that this, we want to find out about this fellow that's got a rather grim look on his face. The reason is he's just been shot up by Messerschmitt, but he and Bluey have just shot one down each, and the chap next to them's in review, but it's a PR shot. So we might have a pic left to us by some old uncle who's just died, and it's in his collection. And we can think probably it's a Spitfire in the background, so that might give us a few clues. So you might go to the warm world to start with and type in Sergeant Chisholm, and we get 29 people. Well, there's a few of them, 29, but 26 are World War I, 3 from World War II. Of the 3, one's from the Army and 2 of the Air Force. One of the Air Force guys is in 452 Squadron, Spitfire Squadron in Europe. And the other guy's in the reserve pool in Townsville. So we'd be pretty sure that when we click on the 452 squadron name, we're going to have a hit. And we will. It takes us to a photograph, and it's Sergeant KB Chisholm. And so we now have a service number. His initials are KB, and he's obviously a fighter pilot. Just as an aside, I just thought you might like to know, the Warm World photograph and the one I have are almost the same, but they must have been taken just seconds apart. It's most curious because mine's got the Spitfire in it, which the sensor probably would not like because it probably can make out the codes, whereas this one was probably released to the public. Anyway, enough of that. So next is the National Archives. Come up, if you enter the name in this case, you get entries. Only one of them, which hasn't been digitized, relates to our friend. But if you put his service number in, you get 3. This guy's got the same service number, but he's Army. So we can dismiss him and we can go straight to the fact that this one's been digitized, and then we can look at these digital records. Sorry, I'll go back one. Immediately we can see his date of birth, place of birth, and 42 pages is digitized. And there's just a couple of extracts. We find out he's got a military cross, which is interesting for an airman. Flying medal, distinguished flying medal. He's also a POW. And we know his personal, dimensions and whatever. And there's a lot more, which I'm not going to go into. And then you can go to the London Gazette. And coincidentally, he appears down the bottom here under Distinguished Flying Medal, and above him is Truscott, and the 2 of them standing there. So that's just coincidental, but it's an interesting connection. And it gives you the citation, or a part of the citation, which I don't want to read, but shot down 6 Messerschmitts. Not quite, as we'll find out as well. Then you can find his military cross. Now, a military cross is normally a land or an army award, but when he was a POW, he actually escaped and made his way through all these places, joined the Free French and fought against the Germans in the streets of Paris and welcomed the Allied armies. So, I mean, he probably deserved his military cross. So he did pretty well. And he's now a pilot, so he's been promoted beyond his sergeant rank. And of course, the then newspapers think this is one written in 1977 as a bio retrospective. But anyway, other references, there's Trove. You put in Keith Chisholm and you get that 18,000 entries, but the first ones that come up are about him. And so there you go. You've started to build up a pretty good picture. There are other sources. This is the ones you won't find on the internet, even though they got his middle name wrong. But he's now a flight lieutenant, commissioned, died in New York in 1991, ashes transported back. He's now in Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney. It is the same guy, 452 Squadron, and his official record is 5, 2 shared and 1 damaged. And so that's how you find him. And I think that's probably a really good, quick step through finding, particularly someone from that past generation. It applies to same in World War I, Korea, Vietnam, and so forth. Although the records, a lot of the more modern war stuff, the records haven't been released to the public yet, but they will be in time. Squadrons and bases. Air Force website's probably a good start if you just don't know anything about the base. Just give you a really good, quick history. Publish works. Search using the squadron number of the National Archives if you're using a squadron. Don't forget the photos, and Office of Air Force History can be a great help. And I point out the last one, Air of Authority. It's a privately run website by some chap in the UK. It's got an astounding amount of information about the Royal Air Force, including bases, squadrons, senior officers, base commanders, you name it. It's a really amazing research reference if you need to look up something. And don't forget, if you're doing a squadron history in Europe, for example, we were attached to the RAF, and a lot of the people were RAF people as well. 36 squadrons, my example here. Never served on 36, but I just picked them because the CO's reports and the unit history sheets monthly. A lot of these are actually available on the archives now. The Air Force has released a lot of them up to a certain date. But you can also request information from the Office of Air Force History if you need to look up something about one of the squadrons or a base. Top one's about the RAF base Richmond. Bottom one's the CO's report about the unit and whatever. 36 Squadron produced a news bulletin in 1986. I don't know whether they produced any others. That was from the National Library collection. That's where I found that. So don't forget, there are collections out there that you might not expect. And there's also the associations, the 36 Squadron Association, the Air Force Association. They have contacts, they have records in some cases, and they will be able to help. Records, I think Squadron Records is what I meant there. Sorry about that. Richmond. Now, Richmond, depending on when you were there and whether you served there or whether you're researching, it was RAF Station Richmond, RAF Base Richmond, or just RAF Richmond. And each of those can be looked up separately and come up with separate results if you look them up on the net or you're researching it through books and other things. Again, quick look at the Air Force website, tells you what's there at the moment, but there's a button down there that says history. It gives you a pretty notice guide. It might give you a clue as to what you're interested in and what dates you're looking for. And of course, there's so many journals and articles written about Richmond. I won't go into them. There's hundreds of them. You just have to find them. Some of them are good. Some of them are so-so. But there's plenty of resources out there if you keep looking. And of course, there's quite a few references. Some of you may have known the late Neville Hayes. He's put a lot of effort into that one. And same with the late Derek Roylance. He also did that too. I don't know Arukin, but it's another one as an example of something you might like to look up. And don't forget, we had stuff overseas, and the stuff Butterworth, for example, we did have. This is the base squadron, not the flying squadrons. This is the base, and it's mainly talking about visitors and postings and stuff like that. Pretty boring, but it might help fill in gaps in your knowledge about who was running the base at the time. This guy here, for example, O'Brien in 74 was appointed temporary commanding officer, for example. And don't forget the other reviews. I said Area of Authority, that's the website, rafweb.org. And this is just my little quick extract of what they've got for Butterworth. And it tells you all the Royal Air Force squadrons and the dates they served there. It's only the initial access page. You can pay a membership fee, £7.50 a year, and get further information. And the money goes to help him put stuff into it. So that's just an example. Click here for image. When I clicked, it said pay the £7.50 and you get the image. So pretty good. All right, let's wrap this up. Putting it together. You've done all your research, you've got all your stuff in folders, capture your ideas, you've got notes, you know kind of where you want to go. Get them in order now and think about rough chapters. You know, you can do it thematically, you can do it chronologically, or you can do it haphazardly. And I've seen all three. It's just a matter of your choice and your preference and how you want to present your ideas and your research work. Build a bibliography from the start, and that's important because it's amazing how you get to the end and you've got 3 days of work to put a bibliography together, because you've got to go through every chapter, check out you've already referenced it, check that you've used it or not used it. Do you put books in that you look at and go, no, I'm not going to use them or use it? Up to you. If you don't, you call it a select bibliography, which tells the reader that you've actually done a lot more, but these are the references that you've actually used. Catalog your sources, remember to acknowledge them. Select your photos, charts, and graphs. And don't forget, maps, charts, and graphs can be very helpful. And you might find one at the very start, and if you put it away and you can't find it again, it's lost. But if you've got it in a folder, you can go right to it. Now, do not be afraid to circulate your drafts. If you're very sensitive, don't write. But it's important that you do that, because the last thing you need is for you to publish your heartfelt efforts and it gets out there and people start writing to you and say that. So you have to keep checking it because it sneaks up on you and changes it back again. And don't forget to back it up. A couple of USBs or removable drive. How many times has the computer, just as you're about to hit the send button, crashed? Don't laugh, Jenny, I can see you. But it's true. Now, my parting thought, just because you don't know about it or you can't find it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
I was just going to add a couple of things, Mark. But doing the histories, I found you couldn't absolutely histories and you needed to double check.
Absolutely.
Because very often they were either written, weeks or months after the fact. The other thing is, don't be concerned about asking other organisations for assistance. So, for example, in some of the work that I'm doing at the moment, I needed some World War I maps. So I found them on the West Point website, would you believe?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And so I contacted the person who was the contact, said, look, this is what I'm working on. Am I able to use your maps and I will cite you? Well, he sent me high-resolution copies of the maps.
Yeah, no, great.
Nothing, yeah. And the other I got similar response from was heraldry.
Does it look like that?
Mine is digital.
Yeah, well, I'd like you to send it to me, please, if you would.
Okay.
From July 1945, which I found in a bin.
Yeah.
And it's 1,989 pages.
Yeah, I've got it digital for various years, not just 1 year. Yeah. Okay, anyway, that was all I was going to suggest.
Yeah. I'll talk to you about that separately. I'd like a copy. Yeah. Okay. Peter Dunn, I think's next.
Just a question, Mark, a quick one. What's your view on colorized photos?
Yeah.